All right.
All right, well, let's get started then. Thanks very much for coming, everyone. And good morning on the first, or I guess second day of TechEd. Today, just so you're all here for the right session, we're going to be talking about Microsoft Office 365 identity and access solutions. So we'll probably be covering directory sync and ADFS configuration as well. So my name's Toby Knight. I'm based in Sydney and I've only been at Microsoft for a pretty short time, about 6 months. And my role is a technical specialist for the Office 365 technology suite. And I'm joined by Mike Mahoney, who I'll let introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Mike Mahoney. I've only been at Microsoft for 20 years next month. And my experience with Toby is he knows exactly what he's talking about. So, I mean, he's leading this discussion. I'm here to support him. My role is solutions architect. I work in the Office 365 product team back in Seattle, in Redmond. And my job is to support the TSPs and the technical pre-sales and into deployment for Office 365. And make sure that they have what they need, and we gather feedback from customers for products moving forward. So happy to be here. Thank you for showing up today.
Yeah, he's also very important for me because every time I architect or look at getting a customer to the Office 365 platform, Mike does my technical review for me. So you make sure that the solution that I've been talking about actually works for the customer, which is actually a very important part of the way we approach the business. So today, we're going to cover off the different types of identity options. There's 3, and we'll cover all those off. We'll explain when you would apply each of the different options, and you may use multiple options in a single tenant. And then we'll look at federation. I'm going to actually be taking you through a live demonstration of a hybrid or an on-premise environment that has ADFS configured. So we'll walk you through those steps and some of the considerations there. And then we'll talk about the various deployment scenarios. Mike will talk about that and the impacts on the end user's client experience, and then we'll ask questions. I'll ask you guys to ask questions. Also, if you have any questions, burning questions on the way through, feel free to put your hand up, and Rab will run around. Rab's over there. We can't see you very well, so because of the lighting, but Rab will find you and get the mic in front of you. So Rab, keep an eye out.
Before we jump in, how many people hit the overview session of Office 365, the prior session? All right, so pretty good turnout. Wish we had this room, huh?
Yeah. How many people have actually implemented ADFS or Office 365 today? Quite a lot of you. Good.
Great.
Yep. So what we're telling you today won't be new for everyone. Did I just turn myself off? No. All right. So let's look at the Office 365 identity features. So some of the things that we need to look at is what are the password policy controls and who actually maintains those password policies, and you know, is it based on your internal security policy? You know, how is single sign-on implemented within your environment? What we actually do with directory synchronization, and also within Office 365, as opposed to BPOS, there is the ability to do role-based authentication. So the ability to provide access to services and configuration options based on the role that the IT administrator is performing. And also, you know, we work with a lot of customers. I tend to work in the enterprise customer space, so people above 2,000 seats, and quite often there's a third-party partner involved there, either managing the complete service or an outsource model, whereby, you know, as a customer, you need to provide privileges to that partner to manage the service on your behalf. So that's a key aspect of the Office 365 identity features. When you look at role-based authentication as well, you have the ability to provide access to people like your legal department so that they can actually put people on legal hold, review email, do multi-mailbox searches and things like that, and take that responsibility away from the typical IT organisation. So we look at the identity options. The first one is a Microsoft Online ID. So that's where there's no on-premise infrastructure at all. The identity exists only in the cloud. So it sits in that authentication platform, and when a user authenticates, they authenticate against the Office 365 online service. That's useful for a number of organisations. It's typically used for smaller organisations. However, some larger organisations really don't want to have any on-premise infrastructure at all. So if you want to manage the identities in the cloud, then this is the way you do it. The second option is Microsoft Online IDs plus a DirSync service. So effectively in that instance, we set up a piece of infrastructure called the DirSync server that replicates your on-premise Active Directory up into the cloud. The advantage of that is that you then have the ability to have same sign-on log-on. So if I'm user or John Smith at contoso.com in my on-premise directory, I can log on using those same credentials in the cloud as well. The third option is implementing single sign-on directory services, which includes federation. So in that instance, the Active Directory on-premise becomes a source of truth. The authentication actually happens at the Active Directory on-premise. The advantage of that is it means that if you have security policies applied to your directory around password expiration, password complexity, and those types of aspects, then those password policies are applied to users online as well. So it gives you the flexibility and the ability to mitigate risk and ensure that the security policy is based on what your local security policy is. I'm just going to grab a bit of water. I'm choking. Cool. All right, so let's look at a comparison of the different options. So the first one I mentioned is just Microsoft Online IDs only. It's appropriate for smaller organisations, typically, although large organisations can apply this as well. The advantages are there's no infrastructure required on-premise at all. So it's an easy solution. You can get up and running quickly. You can create a tenant, and within 30 minutes you can populate that tenant with user IDs, send those out, and users can start accessing the service. The cons are the security policy around password expiration and complexity and things like that are governed by Microsoft security policies in the cloud. There's no single sign-on. The user identity and password is different, potentially different to that of the on-premise user ID and password. There's no ability to do two-factor authentication. And as it says, the IDs are mastered in the cloud. So the second one is MS Online IDs plus DirSync. The pros are that the users, the source of truth for those users is the on-premise Active Directory. It enables coexistence, so it means that if you're doing things like email routing, having an on-premise email solution during migration to the cloud, you can set up email forwarding and things like that. And also, it means that things like your global address lists within Exchange and things like that come from the identities on the on-premise directory. The advantages, the disadvantage of that is, again, there's no single sign-on, there's no two-factor authentication, and the users, although have the same username in both instances, they have different password policies, so they need to maintain and manage password sync themselves, or you can use third-party tools to do so. And there is some on-premise infrastructure required. So typically what we're seeing across the board in larger deployments is the implementation of this third option, which is federated IDs plus DirSync. So that's the implementation of the ADFS infrastructure. The advantage of that is that ADFS infrastructure can be used against a number of different services. So it can be used against Azure, for example. So although you're putting it in once, it can be used multiple times. But the real advantage is that all of a sudden your on-premise directory becomes a source of truth, not only for the username and password, but also for the security policies applied to that directory as well. So the customers get maximum control, as well as the ability to do things like single sign-on through to the services that are hosted in the cloud as well. The other advantage is it enables you to implement some strong authentication. So the ability to integrate some two-factor authentication. An example of that may be certificate-based or smart card-based authentication. The cons are you are implementing infrastructure on-premise. So when we'll go through this in more detail when I show you the lab environment. However, there's a number of different infrastructure components that have to be on site and they have to be highly available because they are involved in every authentication request and effectively every access to the service, then those servers need to be available at all times. So I'm going to hand over to Mike now to talk about the sign-on experience.
Thanks, Toby. So I want to be really clear about something. When we say single sign-on, it doesn't mean no prompt for credentials. And we'll get to that here in a second. But the single sign-on experience is there's one identity, there's one credential, and there's one password. Okay, and that's all maintained back at the customer's Active Directory. All right. The single sign-on user experience is a little bit different. As you'll see from the slides and from the next slide that I'm going to bring up, the users are still going to get prompted one time, even with Outlook, the full Outlook domain join client. Okay, there will be in the future as the platform evolves, there will be a seamless integration there, but users are still going to get prompted. Okay, but they are going to use their own user identity. So for me, it's a Redmond/Mitchum. I just log on and I use my same credentials. I'm running Office 365 just like you will be. So when I start up Outlook, it comes up, it asks me for my credentials. If I've saved them, they're cached. You just hit enter, it authenticates, I'm okay. If I don't save my credentials, a lot of customers don't like to have credentials cached like that, then you just enter your credentials, you press OK and you're in, all right? But I will get prompted for that. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Thanks. Okay, so there is a difference. There was intended to be a difference, and you might have seen some slides in the beginning that said if you're running Windows 7 and Outlook 2010, that the user would never get a prompt. That was the intent. During production, during the development process, we did have to make some changes so that user experience is not realized today, but it will be in the future. Okay? So, like I said, Outlook brings it up, you enter your credentials, you press enter, you're logged on. Now, one experience I need to make clear is on the Outlook Web Access in a federated identity. So when I go to Outlook Web Access, I go to outlook.com/microsoft.com, and I get the standard UI that everyone will get in online. You put in your username, michael.mahoney@microsoft.com. Immediately it knows that I'm a federated identity. So it tells me I have to go to this other URL. It automatically redirects me, but I do get redirected to my ADFS proxy. Okay? So the user experience is actually, you get up there, you put in your username, you press enter, it redirects you, you actually have to then provide your Active Directory credentials. So with OA, it's kind of a two-step process, but you're still using your own online or your own ADFS Active Directory credentials to authenticate. I'm going to pause, and I mean, it's kind of convoluted, but I want to make sure that that's clear. Are there any questions on that? There's a question down front, yes?
Is there a time frame on when it can be?
The question is there a time frame on when proper single sign-on will come out? Let me start by saying, if you look at this PowerPoint, you can see it really, a lot of it depends on what platform you're running. XP, we're not going to have single sign-on for those XP guys forever. Windows 7 with 2010 with a NAGO 2 protocol. When that's released and in production, that will hit it. I don't have a schedule of when that will be. So we ran into some scalability issues internally on the Microsoft side. There were some conflicting issues. We decided not to go into production with that feature today. But absolutely, we're going to get there. Requires some client credentials and some client updates, but we will get there. Any other questions on that whole Outlook Web Access experience? That was kind of a surprise for some customers in the very beginning when we went into beta. Question up there?
Can you link directly to your ADFS proxy?
Yes, you can. So that was a great question. Can I just have a link to my ADFS proxy instead of getting that multi-redirection? Yes, you can do that. So that the clients can go in there, go right there to the ADFS and then get authenticated. Yes, you can do that. Okay, great.
Okay, so I'm going to just give you a quick overview of the process, and then I'm going to show you how to do it using my lab there. So effectively, I'm going to show you what the setup steps are, what the authentication flows are, and the deployment scenarios. So if you look at this, a key part of this is the PowerShell module to actually enable and register the on-premise domain with our Office 365 service, so effectively setting up a trust between the two environments. You then need to connect the ADFS service, well that's the setting up the trust, to the Office 365 environment using PowerShell commands, which I'll show you in a second. And then you need to add the domain and provide proof of ownership. So you need to go through a verification process on the online service to ensure that you're the actual owner of that domain, so that when you authenticate, we can route the authentication request back to your on-premise environment. So the way this actually works is the first thing you do is add the domain into your Office 365 premise and verify that domain. I'll take you through that process. There's a couple of steps that you need to do with your service provider who hosts your domain name and obviously the DNS servers there. And then you put in the trust. So you run some PowerShell to create that trust relationship between your on-premise environment and the Office 365 environment. Oh, I'm going backwards. And then you add the domain. So once the domain is added, which is the final PowerShell script that you run, as soon as that's added, you can then implement your DirSync capability, replicate those users up into the cloud, and then apply service to those users. So apply Exchange Online or SharePoint Online, and at that point, the users can then access that service, and they'll be authenticated via the local ADFS infrastructure. So I've just talked about this. So I'm going to demo this environment now. So a key initial resource for everyone, in case you're not aware of this, I'm sure that most people are aware of this.
Which, hang on, we need to switch.
Yep, good call.
There you go.
All right, good. So this is an online resource, and we'll provide links to this later on, but effectively it's the online deployment guide. And this is really your Bible when you want to look at configuring different components within Office 365. It's very detailed. So for example, if I want to set up, goes through a typical kind of project plan, whereby you have a plan phase, which is really important as part of an Office 365 implementation. The prepare phase, where you go through and implement ADFS and DirSync and clean up your Active Directory and make sure that the specific attributes are within your on-premise Active Directory and things like that, and it's at the right functional levels. And then the migrate phase. So it's a good document to look at how to actually get things done. But if you look at the prepare phase, so when you're looking at implementing the ADFS components, there's really a number of things you need to do. The first one is highlighted there, and that's updating the schema. So if you want to implement Exchange in a hybrid mode, so you have an online, accessing the online service as well as an on-premise Exchange 2010 server, you need to run some schema changes to update some attributes. Some of the attributes that we update are things like the X500 address, where the Exchange archive's sitting, and whether the mailbox is on premise or in the cloud and things like that. And and also there's a write-back component. So if you have services in a hybrid environment, you may have some users in the cloud and some users on-premise. You may have Exchange, their mailbox sitting on-premise, for example, and just the user's archive in the cloud and all those types of combinations. By enabling write-back, we can seamlessly move users back and forth and make sure that they're accessing resources in the right places.
I think we should actually rename it to copy back, because what we're doing in that scenario with DirSync is it's copying those parameters from the online service into your Active Directory. So you hear write back, and
It gets scary, doesn't it?
yeah, people think about online is now writing to my directory. Well, it's not really that way. The DirSync utility is running under your service credentials on premises, and it's reading those attributes for like archive, etc., and copying those back into your own AD. And you have the ability to turn those on or not, but it's really that copy back functionality.
Yep. And the second stage is really cleaning up the Active Directory. So there is some requirements around ADFS and the types of domains that we can register. So for example, if you have an on-premise directory which is called contoso.local, that's not a domain name that can be routed up through the internet. So you can't register contoso.local in public available name servers, for example. So you really need to change that attribute to something that can be routable, so something like contoso.com. And the way you actually do that is to simply update the UPN of the user's attribute. So if you do have contoso.local, you don't need to go through and do a domain rename. You just simply add a domain suffix for contoso.com and then make sure that the users that are accessing the services in the cloud have the UPN attribute, which is contoso.com. So that's the type of things. And there's also some special characters that we can't replicate up into the cloud, and you need to do things like remove duplicates and things like that.
There's a question up here.
Yeah.
That was with multiple domain names as well. So if I've got multiple email domain names coming, could I have multiple UPNs?
Yeah. So the question is, if I have multiple domain names, so I don't know, contoso.com, fabricam.com, or something like that, can we support that within this solution? The answer is yes. So we support subdomains, and we also support multiple user principal domain names. You need to register each of the domain names. And actually, if you have a subdomain, you can use the same ADFS infrastructure and create a trust there. So you can have users.fabricam.com and fabricam.com, and you just need to register those fabricam.com first. If you're going with two separate domain namespaces like Fabricam and Contoso, then you would actually need two ADFS infrastructures in place. So shared ADFS proxy, but two ADFS infrastructures in place. So the ADFS servers themselves can't host two separate domains. So it's an important thing to keep in mind.
One thing to point out is the DirSync 2.0 that shipped with Office 365 did also have the new capability to replicate additional proxy addresses. So if you're contoso.com and you're also abc.com as a proxy address, we will still flow those over there. So you can maintain them on premises. DirSync will copy them up there. With a BPOS 1X environment, you had to recreate them, or after that user was up there, you had to repopulate that proxy address. So that's a nice addition to the service.
And also an important thing to note, as we're talking about DirSync, when we replicate users, we can only replicate users or sync users from a single forest today. That's changing over time. So you can have multiple domains within that forest, but only a single forest. And I don't know if Mike, you want to comment on when that's changing or what's going on there?
Yeah, so we're single forest as a source. DirSync copies from a single forest. We will have multi-forest support through a FIM-based management agent. I don't know exactly when that's going to happen. It'll be third or fourth quarter calendar year to the first quarter next calendar year. But it is coming. It's definitely coming. Toby, do you talk about the number of objects to be replicated in the DirSync? You have that? Yep. Okay, great.
Yep. Okay, so what I have up here is my lab, which is in Sydney. So that's an on-premise environment sitting in the Microsoft North Ryde office. And I have the typical infrastructure that you'd require from an on-premise environment. I'm doing the hybrid exchange session later on this afternoon, so I've got some exchange servers sitting there. We have our domain controller, domain controller, which also has our ADFS farm sitting on it. And we have our ADFS proxy, which is sitting in our DMZ and our DirSync box. That is actually connecting to a tenant in the cloud on the Office 365 service called ptybpos.com. So you can see here that we have a number of different domains configured there. We have the online, the ptybpos on Microsoft.com, and we have the stuau.com domain. So the ptybpos on Microsoft domain is purely online users. So, they're all managed up in the cloud. The stuau.com domain is set up as an ADFS server, so that's all maintained and managed from an on-premises scenario. So you can see there straight away that by having a single tenant, I can actually separate online users and on-premise users. The key differentiation there is that they have to be separate domain namespaces. So they can't be a separate, a subdomain. So I couldn't have, child.stuau.com up in the cloud, but I can have ptybpos.com.au. Is there any questions there? Can't see. Cool. All right, so the first thing we need to do when we're doing this, and this is the easiest step, I guess, is to add a domain. So you simply come in here and add a domain. So it would be a domain name that I own and that I have rights to verify that domain name against. So we've added one here called o365ptybpos.com, and we've also already verified stuau.com. We own the domain name for that. As soon as you add it, it goes into a pending verification state. And you'll notice here that you end up with a points to address record. Now that's important because that attribute is what Microsoft Office Online, the service, uses to verify your domain name against. So the second step that I need to do is go to my domain name provider, and in this instance, I'll show you the stuau one. Oops. And I need to create a text record, a text string, a resource record. And you'll notice there that we have the stuau.com in and a text record with that same attribute, the MS878, 20170. So that's the same record that's sitting there waiting within the Office 365 tenant to verify that domain. Now, once you make that change, it can take up to 3 days to replicate through the internet across all the different name servers based on the time to leave of the domain name. So after adding the domain, before verification can be complete, it can take a little bit of time, so you may need to plan for that. Once you're done, you've verified the domain, then you go into this state. Go back. And it becomes an active domain. So that means that Office 365 is aware of it. It's gone through the verification process. So at that point, you can then go to your on-premise infrastructure and start configuring that component.
There's a question up there.
Yeah. No, you need to maintain that text record. Yep. Any other questions?
So the question was, after you verified, can you remove it? And the answer?
No.
No, you need to maintain that text record.
Yeah. And there is some people who are migrating from BPOS to Office 365, and there's also some steps you need to do to re-verify that against the Office 365 service as well. So effectively, from a Microsoft perspective, you can only verify one domain against a particular service. So as you're going through that transition phase, there's some steps that need to happen there as well. All right, so that's pretty much it from an on-premise from an online perspective, I'll just give you a look at some of the users, so you just get a feel for what it looks like. So we have a bunch of online users, and they're all in that ptybpos on Microsoft.com domain. And you see that icon there. It's just a normal person. And then you have the ones that are replicated using DirSync. And you can see they're up against the stuau.com domain, and they've got a changed icon. So it's an easy way of quickly verifying and differentiating between users and where they're actually sitting and where the source of truth is coming from those users.
And one point on the DirSync piece. With Office 365, once you enable DirSync, we don't allow you to turn it off anymore. All right? You used to be able to prime the BPOS S environment using DirSync, just copy everything up there, and then just let it go, and then turn off DirSync and not worry about it. It creates this bifurcated environment where updates aren't flowing back and forth, and there's a lot of potential for disconnected mailboxes. Well, with Office 365, when you DirSync an object, it's considered to be DirSynced. The source of truth is now on premises. You cannot update it up in the cloud. Okay, with BPOS S, you could DirSync it up there, you could make changes, and then you had this conflict on problems. With 365, you DirSync the object, and the source is still on premises. What Toby just showed you earlier is there were online IDs and DirSynced IDs. Well, the online IDs are the ones that he created either manually through the UI or through PowerShell. Okay, and that's the difference there.
Yep. So you can trial this. The second stage is really a directory cleanup. So you've done that. You've applied the right UPN, user principal name to the different user objects. And a good way to trial this is to set up a new tenant, register a domain, so verify that domain, and make it disparate from your existing enterprise domain. And then simply, for the users that want to participate in the pilot, just update that UPN attribute for those users so you can give them a pilot domain effectively. At the end of that pilot, you can just change that UPN back, and they will no longer participate as part of that authentication process into the cloud. So that's a good way of trialing that as well. So the next step, once you've done your directory cleanup, is to install ADFS. In this instance, I've installed it on the domain controller. Typically, you would install it on a standalone member server as part of the domain. It needs to be a 2008 R2 box. And it's just a member server in the domain. And there's two options. The first option, when you install the initial ADFS server, is to install it as a standalone server. So again, that might be a good option for a pilot server, but it becomes a single point of failure. So typically, enterprise organizations would install the ADFS infrastructure as a farm. So in that instance, they've got a separate SQL server, and they've got a number of member servers that are participating as part of that ADFS farm, and they could be in a single data center, at least two, and typically you'd have another pair at a secondary data center. So from an ADFS perspective, to provide high availability, you're really looking at a minimum of 4 ADFS servers split across multiple data centers. Again, it needs to be highly available because every authentication request is coming back through that infrastructure.
In fact, the guidance recommends against installing that ADFS server the way Toby did it on the domain controller. Yeah. So the member server is definitely the way we recommend.
Yeah, you definitely wouldn't install it on the domain controller. So once you've got the ADFS component, you need to install some certificates. So the certificates that you need to install need to be public. The root certificate provider needs to be a public certificate authority. And that's because the domain names are routable, and we're accessing services across the internet. So the service, and also typically for an ADFS proxy, you're actually connecting to to server IP addresses. So if you set up a farm of ADFS servers, you typically have a network load balancer in place. So you have a single IP address to register against that ADFS proxy farm, and then you would have a C name or an A record that would point to that, which would reference that load balancer IP address. That enables you to do easy failover without having to register each of those different IP addresses. So basically, once you've done that, you've installed ADFS, and the next stage is to run some PowerShell. So you can see here that we have a relying third party, which is a Microsoft Office 365 identity platform, which is a service that we've created the trust against, and I'll show you how to do that. But on the same token, you could be have other third parties that you're relying on as well. So for example, you could be using this infrastructure to authenticate against the Azure platform. So to configure this,
Yep. The question is, do you have to use ADFS? And the answer is yes, you do. At this time, the SAML authentication source is limited to Active Directory Federation servers. There are plans to open it up. I've actually heard of another partner out there that has their own identity platform. It's not certified, it's not in use yet, but they're making progress on it. But today, I mean, the limitations today are ADFS. I don't have a full roadmap that I could talk to you about what other SAML sources we can use today. Sorry. I'm sorry, what about what? Today, we don't have the ability to support another identity partner as a reliant party. Not today. So it will come. We are making some roads there, but first major release with ADFS, we had to scope the problem to something we knew and we could control. So that's kind of where we are today.
Okay, so you've installed your ADFS infrastructure. The next step is to really create that trust to your online service. So we go into PowerShell, and we have some command lists that are available for the Office 365 services. So to actually get access to those, we have the what's the client called these days? The client, the client services connector.
There you go.
Yeah, client services connector. So you actually go to the portal, install the client services connector, and that'll install the PowerShell components for you. So once that's done, you simply run some commands. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually get my credentials to access or to authenticate against my PTY BPOS tenant. It's always hard typing on stage. So I need to authenticate using an admin of the tenant which is online. So in this instance, it's global admin at ptybpos.com. So effectively what I've done there is I've stored those credentials in that variable $cred. So I'm going to use those later on, and I'm hoping I typed them in correctly. So the next thing I need to do is actually connect to the online service. So again, another PowerShell command. And this is all very well documented as well on the online portal. So if you go to the Office 365 site, either there or in the deployment guide that I showed you earlier, all these commands and all these steps are very well documented.
The online deployment guide is a really good source of information to help step you right through all the processes. I want to emphasize planning at this point. I mean, Toby talked about it earlier, but especially when you start to go do something with your primary domain, the public domain, you want to get it right. Because undoing that is, it's not simple. And everything relates to it. So we really recommend using, the first time you run through this, set up a test domain, register it out there, go through the process using that test domain. Just don't use your public domain, your corporate public domain name the first time you're running through it, because you will learn and you may make mistakes. And if you do that,
yep,
it's not immediately. You can't undo some of those changes immediately.
All right, so I've just connected to the service. I've authenticated using those credentials that I added earlier in that dialog box. So now I can actually go in there and add a new domain. So if I wanted to add the AUSTU domain that we created earlier, I'd simply run that add federated domain. Because that domain's been verified on my tenant, then that trust relationship then gets put in place. So I've verified my domain name online first. I've installed the ADFS infrastructure, including the certificates that I need to get back into my ADFS component. And then the next step is to connect to that using PowerShell and add that domain. Once that domain's added, that trust relationship is effectively in place. So rather than add one, I'll simply get some information on that. To get the domain name again, I always forget what my domain name is.
Just while you're typing, I'm over here. Woo.
Yep.
Just a quick question with ADFS. If a user, say, is at home or an internet cafe and they can't get access to the ADFS server, will they get access to the system at all anymore?
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Yeah, could you
You
say,
can't hear me?
Yeah. So
if a user is you're using ADFS and they're sitting in an internet cafe and they can't get access to the ADFS server, can they log in at all?
Okay, so the question is, if you're at an internet cafe and you can't get access to the ADFS server, now are you talking, do you not have an ADFS proxy or anything exposed to the internet at all?
Your on-premise infrastructure had gone down and you had no access to it.
Okay.
Are you completely locked out?
If you do not have access to your ADFS proxy server, which then goes to your ADFS server, you do not have access to the service. So the question is, if you are a federated ID and you log on and you don't have access back to your directory, your ADFS servers and proxies, you can't get to the service. Okay? That is a differentiator between the online IDs and the federated IDs. We always go back to you to authenticate for federated IDs. If I can't get there, I can't get there. And I'm not going to authorize anybody else. Yep. Yes, we do. So, like for myself, I never reboot my machine and I just open it and close it, go to sleep mode. Those credentials are cached. I will be able to get authenticated for 8 hours or so. I think the token's 8 hours time to live.
am I not typing this correctly? Obviously not. Get. Oh. MSOL Federation property. There you go.
You've got it written right down.
I have. I should have read that, eh? All right, so because I know that this domain's been federated, I just want to see the verification of that. I typed in the domain name incorrectly there. I'm sure I did. stuau.com. Sorry?
You misspelled the domain name? Yeah, okay.
Oh, yeah, STAU. Cool. I'll do that again. It's much easier when you're not doing it on stage, I tell you. So I'll do that again. stuau.com. Get that information. So effectively it tells me that the trust is in place against that tenant, and it points to my ADFS server that's been registered, which is sts.stuau. So that, when I was talking about the NLB before, you would add a CNAME record against the against STS if you had a farm. I've got a standalone environment here, but if I had an ADFS farm in place, and also that IP address that's attached to that name record would also be managed via the network load balancers as well. So that gives you the ability to have multi-site failover and also multi-server failover within that ADFS configuration. All right, so once that's done, your federation is in place, and it's really just a matter of then implementing DirSync. So DirSync's really straightforward. Again, when you're looking at implementing DirSync, you can go to the Office 365 portal. There's a link there. It'll download the application. DirSync is based on Identity Lifecycle Manager at the moment. It will be moving to FIM at some point in the future. But when you install that package, it installs all those components for you and enables you to then sync up into the cloud. So again, it will only sync against a single forest. In terms of the numbers, if you have more than 10,000 objects in the forest that you need to replicate, you need to raise a service request and let the Office 365 team know that you're going to replicate more than 10,000 objects. They'll give you a time then to schedule that initial replication.
It's not just a time, it's actually a code to enable it. Now these are really important things here, and they're difference between a small tenant, an extra large tenant, and an extra large tenant. One of those planning items I was talking about earlier that are hard to undo is if you go out and you generate a standard tenant size or an extra large tenant size with your public domain name, if you don't do that properly, then we may have to tear that all down and re-provision you onto a different set of the infrastructure in the background. So it's really important, I'm going to emphasize this, really important to get that piece of it right. Before you do a DirSync, before you establish that entire tenant, we want to know, do you have 10,000 or below user objects or objects? Do you have 150,000 objects? Those are really big components for us to understand so we can provision you correctly. Okay?
Okay, just quickly back on the ADFS stuff. So you also, if you have an online domain that you've been using with just online users, you do also have the ability to convert that domain to a federated domain. So it is something you can do later on. I just wanted to add that in. So the important thing, some of the questions that we get asked about DirSync, once you go through that process and identify how many objects you're going to replicate, and we actually have a tool that you can run against your domain, which is our prep tool, which will then go out there and evaluate those types of aspects. It'll look at how many objects you have, what types of characters or special characters you have against those objects, and all that type of information, and write a report and really let you know where you're at in terms of the cleanup aspects that you need to go through. The second thing is we replicate the whole forest. So there's no way today of filtering objects based on OUs or different domains or anything like that. So once you have DirSync in place, it's going to replicate your whole forest, and so that's an important consideration as well. Once DirSync has been established, it will replicate every 3 hours, and that's automatic. And as Mike mentioned earlier, there's no way of turning off DirSync. Right. However,
I was going to make a note about the replicating your entire forest. We don't have the ability to do a soft delete on a mailbox. So the problem, it's a support issue where if you know ILM, which a lot of you identity guys know, how to manage ILM, set up filtering and stuff, then you can exclude an OU pretty easily. But we're provisioning mailboxes and services based on all of those OUs. If you set up filtering and all of a sudden you disconnect an entire OU, we're going to delete those mailboxes, right? And all of a sudden, all those users in that OU that you've just excluded in DirSync by accident don't have a mailbox. And that is a support third level issue where you get those user IDs back, and now I have to reassign those mailboxes to those user IDs, and only support can do that. So without the ability to do a soft delete on that, I can't enable filtering because of so many customers and the problems and support issues that can come there. We will have that functionality. We will have a FIM-based DirSync that will give you that, plus the soft delete capability on the back end. But today, there's no filtering on your directory.
All right, so at that point, you've implemented DirSync, and then you're really ready to start provisioning users. So if you have, the way you provision users from that point on is just simply add them to your local AD on-premise. Those users will then get replicated up, and then you can assign licenses to those and also assign services to those users. So just to summarise what we've gone through, the first step is really the online prep. So registering the domain, verifying the domain. Once that's complete, get some certificates for the ADFS infrastructure, establish that ADFS infrastructure, create or install those certificates that you've got from your local public certificate authority. Make sure that you've done your AD cleanup and that the domains that you're completing that federation for, that the user principal name attribute matches the federated domain that you're going to authenticate against. At that point, you set up the trust relationship using PowerShell. You then go in and install and configure DirSync to replicate your domain up. If it's above 10,000 objects, notify Microsoft via a service request that that's going to happen, and then you'll go through that process. Once that's done, your local AD becomes the source of truth, and you simply add users to those, and they'll get replicated up, and you assign licenses to those users.
Now, DirSync does automatically run every 3 hours, but there's a PowerShell command to kick it off whenever you need to. So if you add users, you don't have to wait 3 hours. You can push them up there. Question?
Is this DirSync in two-way communication, or is it one-way pushing initiate away from the inside to the cloud?
Okay, so the question is DirSync a two-way replication, or is it one-way?
Probably not replication, it's communication. Who initiate the communication?
Oh, okay. Do you want to do?
Yeah, it's definitely two-way. So when we enable, if you just do a DirSync without writeback, it's one way. If you've enabled writeback, it's both ways.
But to your specific other issue is, it is initiated from your premises. Online environment will never kick it off. We will send you a notice that says, hey, you haven't DirSynced in like 8 hours, and that gets sent to your administrator. So,
Yeah.
But we never kick that off for you. You control it.
Yeah, the process is always managed and initiated by the on-premise
Yeah.
components.
Yeah, I just want to know whether we need provision of public access to that from the cloud to it, because when you initiate out, you can use the private IP address, right? You don't need provision of public IP address, right?
Yeah, so the question was, do we need to make some kind of point of presence known to the internet so that our service can go talk to you to kick off DirSync? No, you do not have to do that.
No.
There's documentation in online about all the ports and protocols and by what services you need to have available. So it's all in online help. Search for ports, protocols. It breaks it down by the service, the port, the IP address that you need to enable on your edge servers.
All right. So now Mike's going to talk about what the authentication flow looks like against the different types of clients.
Okay. Another point about DirSync, if you don't get that, permission to DirSync more than 10,000 objects, we're going to sync 10,000 objects and then quit. And DirSync is going to run into an error message. So, it's well documented, and then you'll have to back up and go talk to support and get a provisioning code to enable it more. But then there could be a problem if you now want 50,000 objects instead of, say, 15 or 20, then we have an issue. So planning. Yes?
Smart objects, it will do everything in AD?
Security groups, users, contacts, distribution lists. We're going to copy all those. Okay. And that's also a change. So we do replicate in the DirSync for 365, DirSync 2.0, we replicate security groups, not just distribution lists. So in SharePoint, if you're applying permissions just at on a security group level, you can use that now. So it's a nice benefit. Okay, so what does this authentication look like in an Active Directory federation? Where does the communication go? In the beginning, a year ago, there were some models out there with these little, there were builds where this little guy would go and talk to Exchange, and then he'd come back, and he'd go talk to your federation server and come back. And they were all wrong. And I'm sorry. And those slides are still out there, so I apologize. I didn't build them, but I did actually replicate some of that misinformation at one point in my life. This is the authentication path for federated identities, right here. Okay, this is vetted with our developers. It is public information, and this is correct as of today. I mean, as of where we are today. The clients will contact Office 365, either Exchange or Exchange will contact the 365 authentication entity or the identity entity, which is, it's really based on live ID in the background, but you don't really have to care about that, okay? So Office 365, if you have a thick client like Outlook 2007 or 2010 or an ActiveSync client, whether you're inside the firewall or outside the firewall, we are going to proxy that request for you, okay? So my client, my Outlook 2010 client is going to log on to to Exchange, and the Office 365 Exchange Online service is going to make a request on my behalf to your internet presence for ADFS. So you're going to have an ADFS proxy out there. It's going to have an active and possibly a passive endpoint for published to the internet. So Office 365 communicates to your proxy, provides my username, credentials, and then it grants you access. Okay? That happens inside the firewall or outside the firewall. The old information said my client would actually go talk to my own server within the firewall. That was wrong. Okay, I apologize. But what does this mean? What does this mean? It means that I have to have an internet point of presence. It also means that today, I don't have a way of validating the client's operating system or machine. Okay? This is being rectified in the next few months. We'll add information to that proxied authentication request where you can look and see, does that user is it the source IP address from my internal network or my external network? So there will be a way that you can manage client access based on corporate machines or not. So today, ActiveSync and thick clients talk to Office 365, proxied authentication request to your ADFS point of presence on the internet. If it's a thick client, then it's the active endpoint, and that proxy request is then authenticated. Okay, a web browser will go directly to the passive endpoint, both internal and external. They'll go to the passive endpoint either on the internet or directly on your corporate network. Looking for nods or blank stares or questions. No questions. That means I probably completely confused everything.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. Good on. So, so when we look at the identity details, the protocols that we support are the WS-star and SAML 1.1, and that's changing. So we'll support SAML P coming later, which will actually I think that'll give you the real single sign-on experience through the Windows 7 and Outlook client. And we also support strong authentication, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So your deployment options, I've covered off a lot of this already, But really, when you're looking at the deployment options, the key things to remember is that it needs to be highly available. So typically you'll have a farm of ADFS servers with at least 2 servers in a single data center. Ideally, you'll have that replicated to a secondary data center as well. So you'll end up with at least 3 ADFS servers to provide you with that fault tolerance and disaster recovery capability. You also need some ADFS servers, some proxy servers in your DMZ, and again, replicate those across multiple data centers as well. That's, as we saw on the previous slide in Mike's conversation, that's for different types of authentication. You'd also really want to start looking at the load balancing and your DNS servers as well to make sure that you have a single point of presence across it to make that easy. So really, when you're looking at preparing for it, you need to think about, most importantly, your Active Directory and what state that's in, what functional level it's at. We only support 2003 and above functional level. Again, how many objects are in there? So run the prep tool. Make sure that the UPNs are correct. So again, we don't support the .local type domain for federated users. There's some characters that we don't support. And a key point is that when you're accessing services, users actually have to log on using the UPN. So, that could be an element of organisational change or end-user change to educate the users that when they're accessing Outlook Web Access from home or from the office, they actually have to type in their full UPN there. So things to consider, start, again, pilot federation. It's quite often a new technology for a lot of organisations. I think in 2 or 3 years' time, everyone will have some type of federated services in place because there's so many cloud-based services that are, using this type of infrastructure. But today, make sure you pilot it and pilot it against a domain that is a pilot domain, so it's easy to switch out or take out. Simply update those users that need to be involved in the pilot and update that UPN. Some of the things you need to consider when you're actually updating that UPN, though, are things like, do I have user-assigned certs? So does my current 2-factor authentication or smart card authentication actually use user-assigned certs that may be assigned to a UPN that isn't, domain routable? If I need to make a change there, then, what are the impacts to that other infrastructure? So you need to look at that kind of stuff during the prepare phase. And start and really do a staged rollout. It's a technology where you can do a staged rollout. You can pick groups of users, and the customers that have the most success and the most seamless transition to an online service really do it in a staged approach. So they do a lot of time preparing, they spend a lot of time planning and preparing, and then they spend a lot of time on those initial pilot groups to make sure that they find out any challenges that are in place there. So we've actually covered off a lot of this already, but the internal and external domains need to match. So it needs to be a routable, publicly available domain name, so not .local. Subdomains are supported. So subdomains are supported on a single ADFS infrastructure. So I can have domain1.contoso.com and contoso.com all registered on the same ADFS infrastructure. If I had Contoso and Fabricome, then I'd need 2 ADFS infrastructures. I can share that ADFS proxy infrastructure though. Don't support .local, and just covered off. We do support distinct UPNs for different within the same forest. So strong authentication. The easiest way to think about strong authentication is that we do support it, but we only support it against the web services. So Outlook Web Access, SharePoint Online. And the way we actually plug in there is that against that ADFS proxy server, we redirect to a secondary type of authentication, whether that's secure ID or a smart card or whatever method of authentication is. So it basically plugs into that web service. So from an end user perspective, they hit that ADFS proxy, they get redirected to some other type of authentication, they authenticate it. Once that's successful, they then get redirected to the online logon stuff. So really, to summarise that, it means that we don't support multiple authentication against things like Outlook 2007 or 2010 on the rich client.
Now, having said that,
Yep.
we are adding additional bits of information like IP address and source OS to that authentication request from Outlook. So Outlook makes that request to Office. Office 365 contacts your proxy. Now we're going to send username, domain name, password, IP address, source operating system. Now if you can implement filtering on that data, that user data that we pass to you, then you can have more control over that. So you could block user access from external, right? So then the user would basically, you could make sure that they are VPN'd into your corporate network, which at that point you can use multiple factors of authentication. So then you can block external access. They'd have to have two-factor authentication to get to the corporate network and then get to the service. So it's a little bit of a circuitous route, but it will be available and you can manage client access that way.
Yep. So, there is alternatives from the ADFS proxy point of view. You can use the Forefront TMG services or the Forefront UAG servers as well. So really we're just looking at a web proxy point of presence, and on the Forefront services, you simply publish rules to provide access back into the ADFS server there.
When you are looking at an ADFS proxy server, if this is a new server or a new purchase for you, make sure you can do URL filtering at that level before that access, okay? Because that's where you're going to have to implement your client access controls.
Okay, so that's the end of the content that we wanted to cover. So just to summarise, it's really important to prepare really early up front, understand your domain names and understand your on-premise domain, and really understand the types of users you're going to put into the cloud. Make sure you go through the AD prep and AD cleanup before you put the DirSync in place. Configure the ADFS components, set up that trust relationship, implement DirSync, and then you're ready to go. But the most critical parts of the whole solution are the plan and prepare phase. So you're really going to make sure you think about that. If you're planning to do that, we have a lot of good resources internally at Microsoft. We have myself and Rab and people in Melbourne and a lot of good partners in this space who can help understand that plan and prepare phase. And really, they're really the two key elements in being successful there. So we're going to take questions and we're going to provide the answers hopefully now. And so thanks for your time.
Thank you. There is a question right here. Can you a little louder? I'm sorry. So like the Mac client with Outlook? Yeah. So Hummingbird, those are all going to be using a POP connection to the service. They're still going to provide their username credentials to our Exchange environment, and then we're going to try to authenticate either through ADFS or not. So the user experience is going to be, they're going to get prompted for credentials. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so I'm sorry. The big question was, with other clients besides Outlook Web Access, what's the user experience? So they're going to get prompted for credentials. They may or may not be able to cache them based on the client. It's going to present those credentials to us. We're going to send those back to your ADFS server for authentication. So,
is the ADFS stuff still available through Telstra, the T Suite product as well?
Rab maybe how to answer that. I don't know the answer to that.
Can you answer that, Wayne?
yeah, same service.
Yeah.
Say yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point. There's no licensing. Here's me discussing licensing again, so keep me here. Keep me honest. But licensing doesn't have any effect on the authentication method that you use. Okay, it's, use ADFS, use online IDs, use DirSync. The licensing component doesn't care. Now you do have to have licenses for ADFS and all that. That's a separate issue.
Up here, up the back.
Yes.
Over here. This way.
Oh,
Where's that?
Over there. Over there.
Okay,
This
thanks.
way. Are there any length limitations on the UPN attribute within AD? The reason I ask is we've got quite a large number of sites that have 4th and 5th level domain names.
I don't know the answer to that question. Sorry. Can you
Yeah.
follow up with us? Do you know?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either.
So the question, length limitations on UPNs or even subdomains, really. I don't know the answer to that, sorry. But we can follow up.
If you want to just send an email to rab@microsoft.com, I'll find out for you.
Yes. Now, most of the customer use their local domain as .local, and this is very common for like a small and medium business. I believe it's everywhere. So, because the .local is not supported for domain federation, what would be the workaround for those customers?
Yep, so so we can support that. All you need to do is add a domain suffix in. So you would, whatever the the domain name is .local, change it to something .com, add a domain suffix through, you go into sites and computers within the AD administration tool. Once you've done that, you can then update each user's individual UPN attribute, and you change that to a .com domain, and then register it. So you just need to update those components. You can still maintain that .local domain, just need to add that domain suffix and update the UPN attributes.
Now that's if you want to use ADFS,
Yeah.
Active Directory Federation. Small businesses, there's a lot of work involved in setting up Active Directory Federation. So they really should be thinking about whether just an online ID is going to be sufficient.
Yep. Yeah, over there, Rob. Yep.
Are there any extra steps if you're going through a migration from BPOS directories in order to ADFS?
Yeah, the question is, are there any extra steps when if you're migrating from BPOS to ADFS on Office 365? So ADFS wasn't available on BPOS, so it's effectively the same process. The transition team would handle the transition of the tenant over to Office 365. Once that tenant's transitioned, you can then implement the ADFS infrastructure. So it'll be the same process, you just have to wait for the tenant to be transitioned.
What's great about the way things are set up with 365 is you don't have to turn on ADFS for all your users at once. That tenant's going to come over using online IDs. Everybody will work just like they did before with their credentials. And then you enable certain IDs one at a time for federation, and then they have to use their other credentials. So it's nice. It's not an all or nothing. You can take it one step at a time. Question?
Just to verify something you said before about cleaning up AD. You said you couldn't have a dot before the at. Is that the dot straight before the at, or could I have like Eric dot?
Yeah, it's a dot straight before the at.
Okay, so I can have first name dot last name at.
Oh, yeah.
The question then was, there was some requirements around the having a dot in the user's name. The question was, can you have a name.john.smith at? You can have that. You can't have john.smith at. So that's the requirement there.
Hello.
That was it? Great, thanks.
Mike, you're out of time, so just maybe one more question.
All right. Last question?
Yeah, one more.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, just acceptable suffixes. Is it? It's not just .com, is it? I mean, so .gov, .gov.au.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Yeah, it's fine. As long as it's a standard internet-based domain that can be routable effectively. All right, so thanks very much for your time today, guys. I have another session this afternoon which takes us to the next level, which is around Exchange Hybrid, and I'm going to be joined by a really good guy from one of our partners. Some other sessions that may be of interest, around this group of technology are up there, so please try to attend as many of those sessions as possible. Don't forget there's a competition. Fill out your evaluation and win a potential to win a touch mouse. So thanks very much. If you have any other questions, please come and speak to us now. Otherwise, we'll be on the stands in the what area is that? Whatever the area is where the
We'll be around.
showcase is.
We have these.
Yeah. So we're here. We're here all
Shirts.
week. So thanks very much, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks a lot.